The auditorium smelled of perfumed money and bleach. Crystal chandeliers, stripped of their civic pretense, were sieved with smoke and the thin, bright light of portable lamps. A hammered gavel echoed like a verdict every few minutes, and the crowd answered with murmurs, with raised palms, with eyes that wanted to own what they had not earned. Behind the velvet curtains and the polite faces sat men who dealt in belongings people wished they could buy back. Favors, secrets, favors exchanged for silence. Tonight, the lot was wrapped in cloth and stripped of name. Only a number, only the quickness of the auctioneer's tongue. People clapped like a jury. Daisy stood on a raised platform, hands clenched in the front of her skirt, her knees tight as wire. Her dress was a borrowed thing, too neat, the kind of modest garment a charity would hand out and then hope to forget. There were daisies, white paper and real petals, tucked into the bodice, as if someone had tried to dress her in innocence. Her mouth tasted like metal and salt. Somewhere in the back of her throat, a small animal of fear folded and would not rest. She had been sold once already by a man who called himself a cousin for $20 and a promise. She had been taken from a ward where women washed other people's sin like sheets and let it dry. She had been given a number and a plastic bottle with cheap liquor in it and told to smile for the cameras. She had been told that the world ends when you stop obeying the rules. Tonight, that rule came wrapped in silk and applause. The auctioneer lifted his paddle and laughed, amused by protocol. "Lot 34, he said. An unencumbered night, fresh, first night, starting bid 1 million. There were soft coughs from the back. A man in a black suit, two faces of wealth, lifted a paddle and smiled like a shark. In the shadows to his right, someone bored snapped photos with a phone, filling a throat of the gallery with images to trade later. The bidders were careful and cruel, accustomed to making people into transaction forms. Daisy watched their hands like they were instruments she could not play. Her name had been removed, or perhaps she had never deserved one. She had come with a tangle of memories, the smell of hospital disinfectant from her mother's bed, the weight of a ring she had once believed was a promise, and the faint sound of her mother's voice slipping away in coughs. She had wanted to be a nurse once, to hold hands that needed them, to burn her fingers for someone's healing. Instead, she had become an object under glass. A hand at the very edge of the room dropped a wad of paper into the auctioneer's open palm. The hammer swung. She was nearly sold. Then a new sound cut through, a click, crisp and unexpected. Doors opening. A man entered with the quiet presence of snow in a city, with shoes that made no noise and a coat that hung like an indictment. He came with two men behind him who moved like anchors. Vincent, his shadow, another, less prominent, more functional, part of the security of people with too much to lose. The crowd clustered around the new arrival because the new arrival was news. He had the face of someone who did not require applause. There was no need to show wealth when wealth hammered the room in whispers. Arthur Howard stepped into the light and looked like someone in a photograph. Tailored in black, tall enough to tilt the room's balance, a presence that cleared noise. He did not smile. When he looked at Daisy, it was as if he had found a misplaced object from a childhood house he could no longer name. Something that mattered without explanation. His eyes were gray, and they held a patience like a closed fist. He lifted a paddle. 1 billion, someone breathed behind him. The room laughed at the absurdity like a shared joke. The auctioneer blinked. Arthur's voice moved through the space like glass sliding over marble. "I will take her for the first night." There was a beat where the room read the statement and decided the rules were different. The hammer fell, not with the practiced cruelty of the place, but with a finality that made small men flinch. Applause bristled, some polite, some envious, others were the thin snarl of disappointment. Arthur pressed a finger to his lips and stepped up without fanfare. His hand reached, For a brief, efficient moment, he checked the papers on a clipboard, and then he extended his arm to Daisy. She didn't know whether to trust the hand. It was large and warm. It smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. For a sliver of time, her life narrowed to the hard, sensible reality of being taken from a room where men assessed her worth and placed somewhere else where a single man had paid to take her away. "Don't try anything," Vincent whispered in an undertone, like a warning and a promise, as if he were cataloging a threat he already knew. Daisy nodded, because that was what you did when someone told you a rule. She walked with them out of the hall, past the glare of lamps that could not look away from the spectacle they'd staged. She wound up in a car with leather seats the color of bone and cold-pressed air. Arthur sat opposite her rather than beside. He had the manners of a man who knew his place in a room was to be watched and therefore to watch. The city melted past in the black of late windows, a river of smudged lights and the rhythm of an urban life that did not pause for auctions. "You're safe now," he said, not asking if she believed it. Daisy wanted to say that the world hadn't made safe spaces for people like her. She wanted to say that men paid for first nights with the sort of cruelty that never left a person intact. Instead, she said, "Where are we going?" and found her voice smaller than she had remembered. "To my home," Arthur said. The name of the place had an architecture to it. The manor on the hill, the mansion, the house that swallowed noise. "You will not speak of this. You will be given food, medical attention. You will be protected." "Protected from who?" she asked. The question surprised her as much as it disturbed him. It was not rhetorical. How much did a man who paid $1 billion know about the danger that followed her like a shadow? "From those who see people as investments," he said. "From those who see weakness and try to make a profit." She sat there, holding her knees together like she was keeping herself in a small box. The daisies in her dress smelled faint and sweet. She had once learned, from a woman in a clinic, that white flowers were sometimes used to hide bruises, to make an image appear less violent. She did not want to be prettified as a cover. In the morning, the house did not feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a world turned inside out, with every hallway polished, every creak anticipating footsteps. Arthur's room smelled of books and citrus. He showed Daisy a room with a window that looked over a garden where real daisies had been planted in a bed of geometric precision. He pointed to a simple vase on the bedside table where petals had been arranged like careful prayers. "Sleep," he said. "We will see a doctor." She slept with the soft sheet creasing at her shoulders and woke to a discreet knock at the door. There were bandages on her wrists she did not remember being applied. A woman in a professional manner introduced herself as a physician and said the word stabilized like it was a contract clause. They asked harmless questions. Where had she been? What had happened? And each answer felt like a coin dropped into a jar she could not open. Selena came to the house 2 days later. She moved as if memory had become a map she had to follow by habit. Daisy had kept the ring she had on a chain under her collarbone, a simple band given to her in a hospital years ago by a mother who had warned her that the world would test her and she should hold on to dignity as if it were the only currency left. Selena smelled of boiled tea and laundry. When she saw Arthur standing in the doorway, she stiffened, like a reed bending under an unseen wind. "Thank you," she said, small and precise. She did not know what to call him, and for the first 2 breaths she only had things to give. Tears, gratitude, a hem of sorrow. "You saved her." Arthur inclined his head. He had habits of reserve, but not of complete silence. "She was not for sale," he said simply. "Not for sale," she repeated, as if saying it aloud could make a difference. The phrase was a kind of prayer, a denial of the ledger. He had Vincent bring Daisy into the garden. The bed of daisies glowed like a small white sea under the sun. The petals were fragile against her fingers, as if they could be crushed by a thought. "You should not be here if your enemies still look for you," he said, "but neither will I leave you to them." Daisy wondered if gratitude could be traded for obligation. Men like Arthur had economies in which kindness bore weight and debt. "We can go," she said, feeling awkward in the grass, as if the yard were a stage set and the real life of the city was an audience that might return to claim what had been removed. "I can go back. I can work. I have skills, nursing skills. I will not be your—" "You will not be anyone's," he interrupted sharply but not unkindly. His voice held the peculiar tenderness of people who had grown used to giving orders for the safety of others. "You will be who you choose under this roof." He said it as if the words were simple sovereignty. She wanted to ask what sovereignty meant for someone whose nights had been auctioned. She wanted to test the promise and find out if it had a seam. They lived in the uncertain domesticity of a house that was both a fortress and a prison. Arthur's presence was a cord that ran through everything. He arranged for doctors and legal counsel, for food that arrived without labels, and for clothes that would not show bruises. He had secrets stacked like ledgers, and he used them with the sterile precision of a man who had been raised to believe that protection could be engineered. Yet, he did not know how to ease small things that fell into dents. A child's laugh in a street, the taste of stale bread remembered on a hospital night. For those things, Daisy was the lesson. In the kitchen, Arthur watched her make tea, awkward hands learning solitaire rituals, and something in his face relaxed. Vincent, who rarely spoke unless spoken to, watched too and made coffee. The household had routines. The house was staffed with people who knew that discretion meant survival. When Daisy joked once, poorly, about paying expensive men in Jupiter for a night of safety, Arthur merely raised an eyebrow. She laughed because the ludicrousness of it kept her from remembering the toll. The first real breach of the fragile peace came in a ballroom far away from the daisies, but no less fragrant with false cheer. Anna Norman hosted a charity gala and used it as a stage to remind the city of power. She wore diamonds the color of cold, and her smile was a blade. The Normans and the Howards had an old ledger between them that neither family cared to make public. Anna had reason to mock a man who had upset the market. She had reason to make Daisy, the woman who had been taken from their auction, into a spectacle of humiliation. They sat at the far end of the room, a table arranged for people who made rules for lesser mortals. Arthur saw Anna from across the room and tightened as if someone had pressed his ribs. Daisy sat at his side with a dress that cost more than the gavel's voice. It felt like theatrics, charity made sharp-edged, indigence masquerading as decorum. People leaned in to watch, not necessarily to listen. "Isn't it charming?" Anna trilled, plucking the petal off a daisy in a vase as if considering the ethics of flower plucking. "The city's most interesting investment made into something pleasant. Tell me, Mr. Howard, did you check the fine print? First nights have a way of having second lives." Her voice was a controlled ripple. She enjoyed cruelty as a hobby and expected applause for it. Her husband laughed politely. Samuel watched from a corner, his jaw like a hinge. Arthur's face remained a passive mask. "I chose to take responsibility," he said. He did not expand on what responsibility meant in a world where men could buy the night of a woman and call it rescue. To him, it was a correction. To Anna, it was a wound she could tease open. Daisy felt the gala like a test she had no manual for. Someone brushed her hand with ink and gossip and left it stained. People used words like salvage and charity. Someone leaned forward and asked, with cruel curiosity, "Did she thank you?" Daisy did not like these questions. They felt like knives under a napkin. She muttered yes because she had been taught to be thankful for the breath in her mouth. Somewhere behind the small talk, the Normans were measuring, considering a reassertion of a ledger they had not yet closed. The escalation was no single moment, but a series of small cruelties that gathered into a storm. Anonymous notes arrived at the house. A floral arrangement was delivered with a single white daisy pierced by a pin. Mild intimidation that smelled like perfume. A car followed Daisy as she walked a block to the small clinic where she volunteered. The driver stayed 3 cars behind, eyes steady as a promise. She found a bottle in her locker that smelled like cheap alcohol, and noticed her hands tremble with the knowledge that someone had been in her space. There was always the sense of being watched, of someone cataloging the faintest of moves. Samuel's violence was a curved, patient blade. He had been raised in the shadow of men who thought power was a birthright, and he had learned to test it gently until he saw which reaction broke a person. He sent messages that were not quite threats, and sometimes included things that belonged to Daisy's past. Names, places, the sound of a street she had once thought she could leave behind. Jeff's name appeared like a loose thread. His cruelty had been an earlier chapter in Daisy's life. Reminders were tactical. They made her small again. Arthur's world was a geography of guarded doors and choices made under watch. He increased the cordons. He moved Daisy to rooms farther from windows. He sent Vincent to patrol the edges like a man who walked the line between protection and siege. But there are predators for whom proximity is a currency, and distance only heightens desire for possession. The attempt came on a night when the snow had not yet learned to fall properly, and the city smelled faint of wet concrete. Arthur had gone out to meet with men whose names Daisy did not know, and perhaps should not have learned. She sat by the window, fingers worrying at a ring she had not let go of since the auction. A knock at the back door, a single polite rap, made her heart skip, because the house, despite marble and servants, had a new ear for danger. She opened the door to a woman who said she had lost her way, who apologized in a voice like water over stone, who was dressed in a way meant to cajole. The woman leaned in, asked for water. Daisy hesitated and then ushered her in. The woman asked questions, soft as gauze, and Daisy grew distrustful. She walked to the sink to pour water, and the woman slipped a folded scrap into her hand, small, slick with solvent. The scrap had a powder on it, white and clinical. It smelled like the tranquilizers she'd been warned about. Daisy blinked. The woman smiled with the practiced charity of predators. "For a drop," she cooed. "A forgetful friend. You look like you could use forgetting." Daisy turned to the door. It had clicked. The latch would not open. The light in the hall had dimmed. Her breath thinned. She swallowed and felt an odd numbness unspool through her jaw. The woman moved forward with the calm of someone accustomed to repeating a script. Daisy shoved the cups, and the woman's hand grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to break bone, but enough for a person to know they were not free. She pressed the ring against her chest, an instinct to assemble, and then everything tunneled. Sounds in the house became like someone playing recordings at the wrong speed. Arthur's voice in the hall turned into a question mark made of air. She smelled flowers and a hot wine, and then sky. This was memory substituted. She fell into the kind of sleep that left waking teeth grinding. When she opened her eyes, she was in a room with white sheets and the steady pulse of fluorescent lights. Vincent stood near the bed and breathed like a man who had been holding his breath for too long. Arthur sat in a chair, motionless, his hand sutured with a bandage she did not initially notice. There were thin lines of dull red on his sleeve where blood had met cloth. A doctor, careful with words, told her they had found her at the edge of the estate, drugged and frightened, and that Arthur had tracked the car to a warehouse where something worse had been waiting. She learned in fragments, like someone assembling a shattered glass, what had happened. A rescue, a fight in the damp smell of concrete, a scuffle with men who had no hesitation. Arthur had gone in with Vincent and a small number of men and met resistance. Samuel's men were there too, as if the Normans had decided to make the evening a spectacle of force. Arthur had been hit, an edged wound, severe blood loss, and he had carried himself out of the warehouse while the attackers scattered. They had gotten him to the house breathing but thin. He had not woken fully for several hours in the hospital he had an arrangement with. He had limped into the room with a quiet that felt permanent and a face older than his years. She wanted to crawl to him, but Vincent was there before she could move. He placed the hand gently but with an authority that made the air part. Not yet. Arthur's hand had a chain wrapped around a finger, and that chain had been a ring. Someone had forced at his chest like a prelude to taking something more than a person, taking a name, and he'd come back without it. There was a precision of loss, not just injury, but the idea that something had been wrenched from him. When he finally opened his eyes, it was like the house exhaled. The light in the room drew his face into relief. He looked at Daisy first, as if cataloging her like a man who was sorting facts. She reached out, shaking, and he grasped her hand with a pressure that was both apology and proof. "You should not have gone near that door," he said without heat. It was a reprimand, not to her, but to anyone who thought boundaries could be breached. "Who tried to take me?" She had the small, keen instinct to ask names as a way of making the threat mortal and therefore limited. It steadied her to know who would have her erased. "People who thought they could buy nights," Vincent said. "People who thought a man's money gave them claim to lives." Arthur's eyes were hard and slippery, and Daisy read in them the terrifying arithmetic of someone who saw wrong as a line that required summation. "They sent Samuel," he said. Samuel, in Daisy's mouth, became the name of a storm. The days that followed were rigid and slow. Arthur did not sleep well. He drifted like someone who had been in a river and had only recently found the bank. There were times when he would sit in the library and not look at books, when he would stare as if light might be a code he could not decipher. Vincent told Daisy over coffee one morning that Arthur had not been himself since the warehouse, that the wound had been deeper than flesh. Daisy's heart folded into a small, fierce place and tightened. She had been the object of a purchase, and now she watched the man who purchased her become fragile with cost. Her gratitude for him was a complicated currency. There were times when she caught herself thinking in the ledger's language: owed, owing, account. And then she would strip these terms off like a coat and try to be simply human. Arthur, for his part, tried to teach Daisy small things about the house, about its alarms and private corridors. He taught her to close blinds with a specific hand motion that felt like prayer, to look at the street before crossing, and to hold a cup as if it were a fragile promise. He would bring her daisy-wrapped bouquets and watch her arrange them with a concentration that made him look almost young. The danger did not go away. Samuel's moves became more desperate. A car torched in front of a clinic. A photograph mailed to Selena's address that contained Daisy's face and a line that said, in precise script, "You cannot hide from contracts." Anna Norman began to show up at events with an air of entitlement, her stare a kind of test to see if Daisy would flinch. The city closed in like weather. Arthur grew more possessive, an instinct that hovered between devotion and jailer. There were nights when he would stand in Daisy's doorway and not step into the room, watching as if by silent observation she could be kept whole. There were times he kissed the hollow of her collarbone with a reverence that suggested he believed the world could be made holy by the act of touch. Daisy felt the tension of the gestures like a cord under strain. She wanted to be free of the ledger that placed her in a new bind. She owed him a life for a life saved, but she also had to survive with her autonomy intact. The closest they came to real tenderness was in a small room in the house called the conservatory. It smelled of damp earth and citrus. The daisies there were wild and windswept, a chaos Arthur allowed but under a gardener's confident hand. She would sit there and learn to stitch, a slow, patient task that taught her hands to be human again. He would sit across from her and read aloud from books about history and the vanity of power. His voice in the space felt like a tether. One evening, while dawn was shading the sky into a thin blue wash, Daisy found a small ring in his hand. It was modest for his class, a plain gold band with a faint scuff. He held it out to her as if to offer a thing that could make sense. "This is yours," he said, "not as payment, not as exchange, as a sign that what happened will not be used as leverage." She put the ring on a chain around her neck and felt suddenly both very young and very old. The ring had once been a promise among the poor, a nurse had told her about. Dignity kept in a small circle. Arthur's intention was not the same as the nurse's, but the symbol was close enough. Then, as if fate had been keeping its breath for the moment when both of them could finally pause, Samuel made his play. The house's alarms were silenced with a knowledge that Arthur had not anticipated. Someone had been inside the property, a mole, who wore Vincent's uniform for a time and spoke with such mimicry that even the house could not find the difference. A caravan of men moved like a tide from the tree line. The attack was precise. They wanted to get Daisy away, to reclaim what had been, to humiliate Arthur and make him pay a price for stepping into a ledger that did not belong to him. Arthur's response was not dramatic. His response was inevitable. He gathered the men he trusted who had learned, under his rule, to act as extensions of his will. They met Samuel's men in a courtyard that smelled of smoke and laurel. The fight was not cinematic as imagined, no slow-motion heroics, but raw, efficient, the work of men who had practiced violence as a profession. Daisy heard the noise, shouts, the dull blows, the clang of metal, and her stomach folded into a place that made breath into a labor. Vincent pushed her into a pantry and locked the door. She could hear scraping from the courtyard and then a single shot, a noise that was loud enough to go inside her bones. She pressed her back against the cold inside of the cabinet, feeling as if the world were closing around her. The house was an animal that had been wounded. It was Arthur who came into the pantry with his shirt torn and a smear of dark on his sleeve. He moved beyond the fact of violence with the matter-of-factness of someone who had expected such a cost. Blood had darkened the fabric on his chest and sleeve. He had a limp. "Stay in the pantry," he told her. "When I say run, you run." He had never spoken to her like a commander, but she obeyed. She wondered if she would ever not obey this man who had bought a knight and then tried to purchase his conscience back with armor and risk. There was a period after the fighting when both of them sat in silence and pretended the world had not split. Arthur's wounds stitched under surgeons' hands. Samuel's face was public now in a way it had not been. He had been captured in images that circulated on social gatherings like a talisman of the old order. The Normans showed their hand by publicly disowning him one way and praising him another, an elite family's way of washing its hands without feeling guilt. But violence leaves residue. Arthur's blood had been on his sleeves, yes, but the deeper cut was the idea that the ledger had been reopened and someone would try again. Daisy saw the change in him. A man once sure of his own margin of control now counted the cost in nights without sleep. One night, when the rain came in sheets like paper thrown at a window, Arthur held Daisy's hand while she slept, fingers wrapped around the chain of the ring he had given her. He kissed the top of her head and whispered something like a prayer. "I will not let them take you," he promised, in a voice that sounded like it might break. Daisy woke with the impression of his promise like an echo in the room. She felt gratitude, and then guilt, and then a fierce desire to repay him in a coin that was not money. She wanted to be of use. She wanted to be worthy. She began, awkwardly, to stitch herself back into a career. Arthur's influence could open doors. He arranged for an internship at a clinic under a clinic director who thought the wealthy had the capacity to erase their debts by patronage. Daisy learned to thread a needle of life again, administering saline without flinching, checking a pulse with fingers that had once been taught to be careful. Vincent watched as she did this, his expression unreadable. They grew closer, with a tenderness that was heavy with history and pain. There were times when the house felt alive. There were times when it felt like a mausoleum. Arthur would bring her breakfast with the steam rising and speak of nothing and everything. He taught her to ride a horse in the stable, as if to show her high ground. He told her stories about the house's past, in fragments that made him look both monstrous and human. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she would find him at the window, looking down toward a city he both loved and feared. She would move to his side and lay a hand on his wrist, feeling the tremor of a man who had given away currency no ledger could record. But love is not a ledger, and the world is not kind to the idea of a man trying to buy what cannot be bought. Samuel's last move was more desperate and more personal than violence alone. He had learned that there are gestures that wound the mind more than scars can. He had found a way to make Arthur pay with memory. They ambushed Arthur at dawn as he walked from the garage to the house. The men were precise, patient. A blow to the head, a masked face, a thing at the base of the skull, a brutality done to make the mind unmoored. Arthur fought as he always would, but he came back to the house a man with a litany of absence. He remembered faces but not names. He remembered how to press a hand to a wound, but could not always find the shape of Daisy's face in a room they had shared for months. At times, he would look at her and ask in a flat, small voice, "Who are you?" Daisy learned to smile with her hands. She learned to give him eyes like a map, pointing to the daisies on the table, the ring hanging from her throat, the doctor's photograph. She learned to cup his jaw and tell him a life like a parable. He accepted her stories and sometimes believed them. At other times, he sat in the conservatory and held a book he could not read, but that he felt like a talisman. Vincent's loyalty hardened into something like prayer. He did not leave Arthur's side. Daisy's fear became a low burning thing she carried in her gut. She loved him with a strange economy, with affection for the man he had been and grief for the man who now had holes in his memory. The cost of his rescue had been higher than money. It was memory paid for blood. Then, as if fate had not yet exacted its final toll, Daisy found out she carried new life. It was an accident of light at the clinic. A woman in scrubbed clothes with quick hands said, "There's a heartbeat." The word swelled in Daisy like a new secret. For a handful of seconds, she felt a kind of inarticulate joy, and then fear wrapped around it like a shadow. This child would make the ledger more complicated, a new line in an account someone might try to read. It would make her a greater target, and Arthur a man who might have to pay a steeper price to keep her safe. She wrestled with the decision of whether to tell Arthur. Vincent, reading her mind like an open page, suggested delicacy. Selina cried with a soft, open grief, and then vowed to teach the child small acts of endurance. Daisy thought of the daisies and how they bent in the wind and then rose again, and thought of the ring at her throat and the house with its locked windows. Before she could decide, the last and worst act of the Normans came with sharpness. Samuel staged a final destabilizing strike. He took her. Not in a scene of grand violence with blood on the floor, but with a cruel, precise abduction that used all the tricks of power. Lies, force, exploitation of those who trafficked in people's despair. He held her in a place that smelled like old concrete and the coldness of men who had made cruelty a trade. The hours that followed were a study in the economy of threat, and although he did not break her with the grotesque imagery of vulgar violence, he broke her with words and with the threat of erasing the life inside her. He wanted Arthur to yield, not only money, but power, name, the surrender of a house, and silence. Arthur came for her. He came with men who ran like an army for their lord, with Vincent at his side, whose face had become carved with worry. They found the warehouse in a low echoing district and met resistance like iron. The fight that ensued was the kind of thing that changes a city's quiet for a long time. Shots fired, men falling, the smell of gunpowder in nostrils. Arthur moved like a man who had learned to use his body as both instrument and shield. He took a bullet in the chest for Daisy. Vincent took another for himself. Bravery in the calculus of the house. Arthur's body folded, And for a moment, the world balanced on a coin's edge. He carried Daisy away under a rain that felt like the city weeping. He bled like a thing that would not relent. In the ambulance, he said nothing, and Daisy held his hand, as if the warmth of his skin could knit him whole. He survived, barely. His blood loss had been severe. He was in a hospital bed with monitors that whispered. He was alive in the mechanical sense, but the arc of the man who had once paid $1 billion to save a night was now a man whose nights were haunted by visits and memory lapses and the knowledge that his body had limits. Daisy sat by him in the sterile glow and stroked the chain at her throat. She thought of the moments in the auction room where she had been another person's lot, and the hand that had reached for her. She thought of the cost that had been paid, and the cost that would be required to keep anything like peace. She thought of the child inside her, moving like a bird, like a proof of stubbornness. When Arthur finally opened his eyes, he looked at her and, for a long time, did not speak. Outside, the world went on with its endless hunger for profit and revenge. Inside the hospital room, there was a hush that felt like a threshold. "You are safe," Daisy said, though she did not know if the word could amount to anything more than a stitch in a tapestry. He looked at her then and tried to speak. The words were fragments, as if language were glass that had been broken into a mosaic. "Love," he said at last, a single word both fragile and enormous. He searched her face again like he was indexing memory. Daisy let his fingers curl around hers. She thought of all the changes love had provoked. The man who had bought a night and then spent nights trying to purchase his own salvation. She had learned the terrible ledger of it. In the silence, she realized the truth the title of a story might try to sell. That money could not buy love. It could buy safety for a night, perhaps, but not the slow, patient work of being known, of healing that leaves scars and also maps. Love, such as it was between them, demanded sacrifice and refused to be parceled out on condition. It could not be purchased and then owned. Arthur watched her and placed his hand over the ring at her throat, as if to confirm that its loop was not a contract but a promise. There were, ahead, days of recovery and politics and revenge, and the risk that no safe place existed for people like them. But as he squeezed her fingers, both of them felt a small, stubborn pulse of hope. Fragile, battered, and uncompromising. Outside, the city took in another breath, and went on with its ledger. Inside, two people who had been bought and broken were trying, awkwardly, to stitch themselves back into something that might be called belonging. None of it had been cheap. None of it promised a neat ending. The war with the Normans had not ended. Samuel still prowled the edges like a dangerous memory. Anna still smiled with knives in her eyes. Vincent bore the weight of choices made and would make. Selina tried to raise hope like a stubborn plant in soil that had been salted by grief. But in the conservatory, the daisies bent in the wind and did not break. And in that small way, the world seemed to offer a test. To keep living, to keep defending the fragile forms of love that could not be bought. They were both left with a ledger, of course, of debts owed and debts repaid. Daisy owed love a chance to be something other than a purchase. Arthur owed blood and patience and the humility of a man who had seen the limits of money. The fight was not finished. It had only changed its terms. When the sirens had passed and quiet settled with a weight that felt almost like pity, Daisy stood and walked the pale halls of the house to the window that looked out toward the city. She touched the chain at her throat and thought of the days she'd been an item under glass, and of every small kindness that had become a debt and also a saving grace. She understood then, without rhetoric, with the bluntness of someone taught by hardship, that no amount of money could buy the steady, difficult work of being loved. She closed her eyes and listened to the house breathe. Somewhere a petal fell. Outside, in the distance, a man called a name, and the wind swallowed it. The ledger would continue, the Normans would not stop, but she had choices now. And for the first time since the auctioneer's gavel had struck, she felt something like the possibility of choosing for herself. The war was not over, the cost was not paid, and there were more reckonings to come. But the night a man paid everything for a single night, the buyer and the bought, into people more complicated than any ledger could contain. They had to learn how to be human in the wake of that purchase. And so they prepared, together and apart, for what would come next. They did not try to pretend the world outside had altered its course for them. The ledger kept its columns, the city its appetite. But inside the pale room where light came like a promise already half withdrawn, they assembled small defenses. A language of care, a schedule of medicines and visits, the fragile catalogue of a life that could still be saved. Arthur learned slowly how to move without pain. He learned the cadence of patience as if it were a trade he had not known he would have to buy. Daisy watched him relearn ordinary things: how to stand, how to turn the page of a book without wincing, how to make a joke that did not bend toward remorse. Each small victory was paid for in caution and in the soft accounting of time. Once, when he laughed too loudly and then apologized for the sound, she reached for his wrist and stopped him. "Keep the loudness," she said. "Let it belong to you again." The child inside her, Daisy sometimes called it simply the bird, moved in unsteady, certain rhythms. When it kicked, Arthur placed his ear to her belly as if he could hear the world that would be born. He listened for the future like a man trying to catch up to his own life. They talked to it in fragments. Names were whispered and discarded. Promises made no sense unless they could be kept without a ledger attached. "We will learn," he said once, voice small with a humility that had not existed in him before. "We will learn to be parents and not proprietors." Outside, plans thickened. Vincent came when dusk was forgiving and left before the full dark descended, carrying with him both the smells of smoke from some tavern and the heavier smell of choices. He spoke rarely of remorse. He spoke more of routes and exits. His face had the weather of someone who kept watch for storms, even when the sky was clear. He had begun to understand that his privileges would no longer shield him, that money could buy a path for a night, but not a life that refused to be counted in coin. His hands trembled sometimes as if the weight of what had been traded for him had finally found its balance. Selina remained the odd, steady heart of the small household. She tended seedlings and hearts in equal measure, coaxing both toward light. She brought flowers no matter the season, because flowers were not ledgers, they were insistences. When Daisy asked what hope looked like, Selina did not answer with words. She took a pot from a shelf, pressed soil between her fingers, and handed it over. "You plant," she said. "You wait. You do not know the shape of the roots until winter comes." Her counsel was practical and unromantic. She believed in small labors that kept people alive. Anna, as ever, smiled with knives in her eyes. She had not come close to softness. The things that had been taken from her had canted her into a blade-edged grace. She joined their conversations like a cold wind, necessary, sharp, useful. She proposed measures, escapes, diversions, debts to be repaid in ways a ledger could not sanction. She believed in retribution as a language everyone there could understand. At night, when the house settled, Daisy would sometimes watch Anna from a doorway and see how pain had taught her to make plans. And Samuel prowled the margins like a shadow that remembered every insult. Sometimes he was rumor, a man seen on rooftops, a whisper in markets. Sometimes he came bearing evidence that the old order had not yet surrendered its hunger. He had not shown his face to Arthur since the first day, but there were traces of him in the world. A century's absence, a closed inn, a man with a knife who suddenly thought better of speaking. Samuel's presence was the city's memory of violence, and memory was a ledger that did not forgive. They spoke of Samuel at odd hours. Vincent offered to broker peace. Anna said the only proper language for Samuel was fear. Arthur wanted neither peace brokered by coin nor revenge lodged in bone. He wanted a life capable of tending tenderness without the constant calculus of cost. If we pay him, he said once, fingers tracing the chain at Daisy's throat, he will own us again in another currency. Daisy shook her head. The chain felt warm under her thumb. We have to teach him a different exchange, she replied, one where we keep what is ours. So they began to fashion defenses no coin could buy, alliances born of gratitude, stubborn routines that refused chaos, a map of places where a woman could hide if footsteps came like thunder. They took what they could from the world that would not be given, a friendship sown with honest labor, a promise that if one fell, the others would carry. They rehearsed exits, practiced names that would be used in an emergency, hid valuable things in plain sight. Samuel's presence was the city's memory of violence, and memory was a ledger that did not forgive. They spoke of Samuel at odd hours. Vincent offered to broker peace. Anna said the only proper language for Samuel was fear. Arthur wanted neither peace brokered by coin nor revenge lodged in bone. He wanted a life capable of tending tenderness without the constant calculus of cost. If we pay him, he said once, fingers tracing the chain at Daisy's throat, he will own us again in another currency. Daisy shook her head. The chain felt warm under her thumb. We have to teach him a different exchange, she replied, one where we keep what is ours. So they began to fashion defenses no coin could buy, alliances born of gratitude, stubborn routines that refused chaos, a map of places where a woman could hide if footsteps came like thunder. They took what they could from the world that would not be given, a friendship sown with honest labor, a promise that if one fell, the others would carry. They rehearsed exits, practiced names that would be used in an emergency, hid valuable things in plain sight. Arthur cataloged what he could: medicines, letters, the small journal where he wrote clumsy love notes to the child he had not yet met. One afternoon, Vincent arrived with a different look, a face that had been warmed by wine or fear, perhaps both. He carried a paper rolled like a confession. I tried to buy silence, he said, and the words landed with the dull thud of a thing that had been expected and not quite avoided. He had met with someone who asked for more than money, a debt that asked for loyalty, for compromises he would not easily make. They ask for names, he said. They ask for allies. They want to know who stands with us. He did not finish. The silence had the shape of a question. Arthur felt the old ledger itch under his skin. The bargain that had once seemed to fix everything had returned as a demand. Give them nothing, Anna said. They will come for it anyway. Better to meet them and show them the cost of taking what does not belong to them. Her tone was not a threat so much as an instruction. She had a way of making violence into a practical decision, as if the moral weight could be held alongside the tactical. Daisy could not bear only plans as skeletons. She wanted nests. She wanted a life where the bird inside her could learn the shape of wings without the world pressing its palm against the sky. She began to stitch small things: a blanket for the child, a stack of simple linens, a song learned from Selena about a river that kept moving despite obstacles. When she sang, even the knives in Anna's eyes found some offsetting softness. Arthur listened, and sometimes his hands stilled, as if worship were nothing more than listening to another human voice staying small against the world. Their preparations had a rhythm: risk, then restitution. A candle put between two windows so the light might fool watchful eyes. A man hired to teach Arthur how to stand in the street and not be taken for prey. But there was one measure none could devise: the unpurchasable test of courage. It did not come with a receipt. On the third night after Vincent's confession, they heard a knock so careful it might have been a thought. Daisy opened the door to find no one there, only a scrap of paper pinned under a stone. The note bore a single line in an unfamiliar hand. "We know you are not for sale." There was no signature, but every name in the house read it as both a threat and a promise. Arthur folded the paper slowly, the tremor in his fingers betraying more than pain. Daisy put a hand to his face and found that he was not the only person who had become a ledger of scars. They argued then about whether to leave, to barter, to strike first. The house became a theater of small councils. Night after night they weighed the scales. Sometimes the scales tipped toward courage, sometimes toward fear. Finally, practicalities decided for them. A messenger to the port town with news that had to be delivered. A midwife arranged quietly in a cottage 2 valleys away. A place that could hide a woman and a child until the shape of the threat revealed itself fully. The morning they chose to move, the city wore a thin sun. Arthur wrapped a scarf around his throat where the ring had sat, as if to remind himself of the promise rather than the market. Daisy tightened the strap of the blanket she had stitched. Selina brought herbs and a small potted plant, insisting that life travel with them. Vincent adjusted the straps of a satchel so often it seemed he had made the movement into a prayer. As they crossed the threshold, the house exhaled. The conservatory's daisies bent toward them in a farewell that felt like a benediction. Behind them, the ledger remained, debts unresolved, names not yet cleared. Ahead, the road suggested both danger and, strangely, an unpurchasable openness. They had not yet decided who would go first, nor had they agreed on the routes. Each took a small responsibility. Daisy to the midwife, Arthur to clear the path, Vincent to meet an unknown ally, Selina to tend the plant of hope. Anna watched them assemble like a hawk. When they stepped into the street, she let a half-smile cross her face, the sort of expression that implied both approval and a threat held in reserve. No one noticed at once the figure on the high wall across the lane. He had been patient in a way that was almost devotion. He watched them take the first steps and then the second. The city swallowed them for a breath, and the figure became only a shadow and then a name: Samuel. He did not move immediately. He waited to see whether they would walk into fear or toward it. Down below, footsteps sounded like a new account being opened. Arthur held Daisy's hand as if to keep the world from counting them separately. She tightened her grip in return, and between them lay the small, stubborn pulse that had carried them through nights of purchase and regret. They walked on. The ledger watched. Samuel watched. The day unfolded its thin mercy, as if asking whether the measures they had taken would be enough. A sound, soft, deliberate, came from the alley to their left. It could have been nothing, but when Arthur turned his head, he saw the suggestion of movement, the register of a man who had been watching for years. Fear, like a coin, changed hands in an instant. Arthur drew in a slow, steady breath and did not let go. "Keep walking," he said, and the voice that came from him was small and true. Daisy lifted her chin. The bird inside her folded and then beat its wings once, as if in answer. They moved forward together into a city that had not yet decided how much of them it would take.